G'day, I'm Owen, you've joined the pub test, and in this one we are continuing the Jack the Ripper Suspect series. And I have to ask, with this, have you ever heard of the Barnardos? Well, if you're from New Zealand, Australia, mostly New South Wales, and the United Kingdom and Ireland, you probably have, because it's a charity that looks after disadvantaged children. But it was Dr. Thomas John Barnardo who founded this charity. So who was he, and how does he fit into the Jack the Ripper saga? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Well, John Barnardo, and he was mostly known as John, didn't use that first name Thomas very much, so I'm going to call him John, was born in 1845 in Dublin, Ireland. Now, his parents had emigrated from Germany, particularly the city Hamburg, and I was going to make a joke here, that's where hamburgers came from, and then I looked it up, and actually that is where hamburgers came from. So that joke was just going to fall flat like a meat patty. But moving on. It's actually said that he struggled a little bit at school, wasn't doing so well. But so he left school at 14, and very common back then, he went to work. But at the age of 17, he had some type of epiphany and converted or became very involved in Christianity, particularly the Plymouth Brethren. Now, I don't know a great deal about them, but they are very devout, you would want to say, and they also like to spread the word. But it was in 1866, therefore, that he moved to London with the intention of becoming a missionary and going over to China, inland China, to spread the message. But for whatever reason, that did not happen. But in 1867, he's now in the London Hospital in Whitechapel, studying to become a doctor. Now, again, don't know exactly why he never completed his studies, but he didn't. But he referred to himself as doctor. Later, he was given what is considered a certificate of competency, but it was almost like an honorary title bestowed upon him for his charitable works. But later on, he did receive what would be basically a certificate of competency, so he could officially use the term doctor in his name. Though, I think that would be more of an honorary title because he was so well known, and maybe helped him because he had been calling himself a doctor for most of his life without the actual qualification. But interestingly, his main focus of study at the Whitechapel Hospital was in gynecology. But as stated earlier, he was the founder of the Barnardos charity, and that's what he was known for mostly during his life. So he started up a ragged school. Now, he wasn't the only one to do so, but these ragged schools were bringing in disadvantaged kids who could not afford an education, and often they were out on the street, and orphans as well. A cholera plague had hit London during the 1860s and wiped out quite a few people and left heaps of kids orphaned. And he was bringing them into these schools. Now, mostly they were religiously based education, yet you could almost consider it a trade school as well. So they would teach them a skill that would allow them to earn money when they left, either shoe shining or something along those lines. In 1870, he started a boys' orphanage, and in 1876, he started a girls' orphanage. And then after that, we see that that was basically the main focus of this charity, was taking these kids in, giving them somewhere to live, educating them, and providing them with a skill that they could then use in the workforce. At the girls' orphanage, they were trained in housekeeping. And at the time, there was still work to be found in that industry in England at that time. In 1873, though, he got married to a woman who was 2 years older than him. And her name, I believe it's pronounced Syrie. And she passed away in 1944, which made her 102 years old. She shared the same evangelical spirit that John Barnardo did, and also carried on his charitable works after he passed away. Now, he passed away in 1905 from what we today would consider heart disease. And it said that this was mostly brought on because he was working so much and hard for these charities. Now, his charitable work wasn't without controversy, though. And I'm not talking about controversies that may have emerged in later years, even after he had passed away, because I do appreciate any organisation that gets a bunch of kids together, and particularly disadvantaged ones, you're going to get some bludger taking advantage of those children, and I would dare say that's probably happened within this organisation. I did not go looking, and I'm not, because that's not the point to this. There was controversy about John Barnardo himself in his lifetime, and some of it he does not deny at all. Firstly, he was charged and taken to court 88 times for kidnapping. Yes, you heard that correct. For taking kids forcefully away from the parents to the point where they had him charged. And he'd front up court. Now, because he could speak well, was very charismatic, and was a well-known figure in the community, he was getting away with these crimes. And I say crimes because in Australia we have what's known as the stolen generation, where the Indigenous children were taken away from their parents. And Australia's not unique in that. It has happened around the world. But people would say, hang on, Owen, these weren't Indigenous as such. These were poor kids living in squalor. The parents weren't looking after them. They were just Londoners, so surely he was doing a good thing. Well, I would suggest that there was enough kids out there that he didn't have to go remove some from their families. Now, without being there, we just don't know the exact circumstances behind all of this, but I would suggest that maybe in hindsight it wasn't the best practice. But, it was achieving something for him. It was getting him publicity in the papers. Like 88 times he was getting publicity. And then people would learn about his charitable works. Because you know what they say, there's only one worse thing than people talking about you, and that's people not talking about you. So if you get in the papers, well, it works out good. Maybe not so good for the poor kids being dragged away from their parents. But sacrifices have to be made, or at least that's what I think they may have been thinking in doing that. But there were other controversies too. It was said that he would take photos of these kids when they first got them and they were just in deplorable conditions, filthy and everything. And then later he would show these photos of how well they were doing now. Look at these fine, upstanding lads. But it was said that those photos were staged and that the orphanages themselves were just terrible as well, that the poor kids weren't living in very good conditions. So they'd drag a few out, wash them down, put new clothes on them, get the photo, and then send them back to this squalor. I would question that only because he was so well known. Surely someone would have checked in on these orphanages and said something or done something. So I think that could have been slanderous. But again, I don't know. But I do know he vehemently denied those accusations. He didn't deny the kidnapping. He said, I did that, but I certainly were not letting these kids live in those conditions. But while all that is interesting, you are here to find out how he fits into the Jack the Ripper saga. Well, many people say that the Ripper had to have medical knowledge, and therefore this bloke, even though not qualified as a doctor as such, had the knowledge and possibly surgical skills to perform these crimes. And with some of the body parts removed from the victims, the study in gynecology as well would fit that description. But would he have been in contact with these types of people? Like, what was he doing during those events in Whitechapel in 1888? Well, as stated, himself and his wife had this evangelical spirit about them, and they were going to spread the word. And he was going to these lodging houses, to the doss houses, and talking to the women there, trying to get them on the right track. And possibly, on a side note, may have just been checking to see if there's any kids he could take and shove in these orphanages as well. But not long after Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman's crimes occurred, He was at 32 Flower and Dean Street doing a bit of a preaching campaign. So he's talking to these women in this kitchen. Now, Flower and Dean Street, you say, that's interesting. And looking into it, Polly Nichols lived, or was residing, I should say, at the time of her crime occurring, at 56 Flower and Dean Street. Annie Chapman was residing or lodging at 35 Dorset Street in Spitalfields, only a couple of blocks away from Flower and Dean Street. Catherine Eddowes' last known lodging place was 55 Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields. And we know Mary Kelly basically lived on Dorset Street. Yes, it was Miller's Court, but you access that court off Dorset Street. And all of these women lived within this 2-block radius at the time of the crimes occurring during August to November of 1888. Except we're missing one. Where was Elizabeth Stride? Well, she was actually in attendance on that day in 32 Flower and Dean Street. And we know that because John Barnardo himself went to the morgue and identified the body and said, yep, that person I was talking to the other day in the kitchen at that particular lodging house. Now, during that visit at 32 Flower and Dean Street, one of the women actually said, look, we're all up to no good. Nobody cares about us, and one of us could be killed next. That was prophetic, because one of them actually was. Was it Liz Stride that said that? Don't know. Was that why he could identify her? Again, don't know, but I will be getting back to him being at the morgue later. But I have to state here, and be prepared for a rant. Insert rant now. If you wish to skip ahead, feel free to do so. But it only really dawned on me in the last week that all these women lived within 2 blocks in Spitalfields during the time of these events. And I've always looked at these crimes from where they were found, not where they actually came from. And to me, it just raises questions. And I think it's safe to say that Dr. John Barnardo probably visited every single one of them. If he was in Flower and Dean Street that day, well, it's possible he'd seen these other women before too. Maybe he'd even gone to Dorset Street to spread the word. But people have asked, well, okay, Owen, where are you headed with this? Why is that so significant? And I have to honestly say, I don't know yet. But it's just churning away in my mind that perhaps these crimes weren't the random attacks I've always thought, but maybe they were targeted. Of course, it could just be total coincidence, and it can happen that way. But let me know what you think about that in comments. Because there's something that's churning away up here. I don't know where it will lead, but it's just got me thinking is all. But that's the end of the rant. Getting back onto this suspect. What would be his motive for performing these crimes? Well, 3 have been suggested. Firstly, that by committing these atrocities, it would shine a light on the conditions of the people living in the East End of London. I mean, London itself was packed, but that East End was 7 times more populated than the main area of London itself, and the poverty and sanitation was woeful. And by getting the media spotlight and eyes on the conditions that people lived in, well, things might change. Or you might get a bit more money for your charity. Now, I know you'll say, oh, and people just would not do that, but you know people have. I won't go into the details, but it's not the first time people have done things to benefit themselves, particularly with charitable work. But that's just one of the suggestions. The second one was religious fanaticism. Having to rid the earth of evil, and maybe in going around and talking to these ones. He picked out a few that he thought were really bad, and then later would go around and perform these crimes to make the world a better place. Quite scary, but also not the only time people have committed serial crimes such as this for that very reason. But the third one, and it basically goes back to a similar thing to Joseph Barnett, the boyfriend of Mary Kelly. Now, I raised this motive in that video, and people say it just wouldn't have happened to try to scare people straight. So the idea Joseph Barnett going around to commit these crimes. Now, considering the proximity of all these women also adds weight to that, and I'll just touch on the reason why. Now, if Joe Barnett knew some of these women, they were nearby, Mary Kelly probably did, so by attacking them it would have more of an impact than just random people. And the idea being he was doing that so Mary Kelly would stop walking the streets. Now, the notion here is that that's what Barnardo was trying to do as well, but on a grander scale. Trying to scare all these women to get on the right track. And then by following that up, by going to visit the areas where some of these women were known. And from that conversation in 32 Flower and Dean Street with one of the women obviously scared for their life, it would have been working. So that is the third motive suggested. But you see, if it was working, if it was starting to achieve the goal, why would you stop? Well, now here's a piece of information that I just cannot, for the life of me, get fully corroborated. But no one has slammed it saying it's just totally untrue, so I'll believe it to be true. But if you know any more information, please let me know. But it's said that John Barnardo had an accident in a pool that made him completely deaf. So not long after the Mary Kelly crime happened, this event happened in his life and he could no longer hear. Now, the cobblestone streets and the police walking in their shoes, you would be able to hear people approaching. But if you can no longer hear while you're performing one of these crimes, then your chances of being caught would be absolutely magnified. And it is absolutely mind-boggling with the amount of people in this area and the amount of people out on the streets at night, how the Ripper crimes were never solved or the person caught. But definitely if you had a disadvantage, like not being able to hear people approaching, I don't think you'd get away with them. And so it's said that that's the reason why the crimes stopped. Well, does this pass the pub test? Well, before you start hitting those keyboards, and make sure you do, because I'm really interested to know what you think of this, I got some against, and then I got some things that maybe we should just consider. Firstly, I can't see that he could have done these crimes because he was so well known. And some of these women hated him. So if they had a sniff that this was the bloke performing the crimes, they would have thrown him under the bus quicker than you would believe. And I say that because could you imagine, you are stuck in a situation that you don't like. These women did not want to go walking the street, but they had two choices. Do that or go to a workhouse. And the workhouses were made so that you didn't want to be in them. So the only other option is to go walking the street just to get money so you can stay at one of these lodging houses, which weren't great places to stay at all. So then you've got some bloke coming to you saying, you should change your way of life and go this way. Well, buddy, you're living in a house. You're doing all right for yourself. Go tell it while you're walking. And also, you're taking kids away from parents. So I can imagine the feeling of animosity from some of these ones. And I don't think they would have covered for him. Just put it that way. And because he was so well known in the general community as well, he would have stood out if he was walking around at night. And he wasn't known to wander the streets. He wandered the streets during the day doing his evangelical work, but after that, fairly quiet of a night time. And there is no evidence at the scene that he was ever there. Yet, there are some things to consider here. The fact that no evidence of him being at the scenes doesn't rule him out automatically. In fact, there's a lot of people that say we actually still have never found the real Ripper in all this research. It's probably someone totally unknown that would not leave any clue behind that they were involved. So the fact that nothing was left behind doesn't necessarily rule this bloke out. But IDing Liz Stride at the morgue, I find curious. What on earth was he doing there in the first place? Like, he wasn't a doctor. Why would they call him in? They already had that covered. And how did he remember her? Yeah, okay, she was Swedish, long Liz, she was taller than most. But I can't imagine, like, if all the people that have turned up to my book signings, and and then something bad happens to one of them and they say, could you identify the body? I doubt that I would be able to. Well, actually, I probably could, because only 2 people turned up to that particular book signing, and I hope if you were there, you're doing quite well. But no, not with him. He was seeing lots and lots of people. And so how one person stood out to him seems strange, and would suggest that perhaps he had spent more time with that person. And I'm not saying in a close relationship way, but perhaps some extra time at Dutfield's yard. The point is, why did nobody ask that question? What is this bloke doing at the morgue? It's just a curious one for me. But what do you think? Does this suspect pass the pub test? I'm not 100% sure myself if he's overly credible. But what I do find absolutely amazing are the connections that so many people have had with these crimes. But let me know what you think about this one down in comments. Now, Dr. Barnardo had not been mentioned in this series yet, but it's not the suspect I have been talking about in the last few videos. That is the next one. And it may be slightly delayed in getting released. There's a lot of information to go through. It will be the start of some of the deeper dives into suspects. I'm quite excited, not only in digging into it, but I'm really keen to see what you think if this next suspect will pass the pub test. But as always, thank you very, very much for watching. It genuinely is appreciated. If you are still here and haven't done so, think about hitting that subscribe button. Think about it a second time and then just give it a little tap. If you like the video, give us a like. And again, to all of you who are sharing this content, because YouTube tell me every week how many times the content's been shared, and it keeps growing. So for all of you out there doing that, it is greatly appreciated too. I'm Owen. You've been watching the pub test, and we will see you on the next one.